Alfredo Santa Ana is a Mexican-Canadian composer who has, since 2003, been living in Vancouver. Among the artists and ensembles that he has collaborated with include the NYO Canada, Standing Wave Ensemble, Turning Point Ensemble, Orchestre de la Francophonie, the Victoria Symphony, the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, and most recently the vocal ensemble Musica Intima. He received his formal training of European Western music tradition at the University of British Columbia, where he wrote a string quartet for his doctoral dissertation in 2010 on the idea of impermanent large-scale form, where the form of the piece changes every time it is performed. Shortly after graduating, he became the inaugural composer in residence for the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at UBC, and he became an associate composer with the Canadian Music Centre. In addition to composing for live performers who primarily play in concert halls, he also writes music for films. He plays guitar in a Vancouver-based avant-rock band called Square, and he produces and performs as Ghost Shepherd, a musical project with his partner and writer Alfredo Santa Ana. In 2021, he released his first album of electronic ambient music called Nightscape. I'm happy to say that I've collaborated with Alfredo on many occasions as a performer in ensembles, and most recently, commissioning a work for myself and flutist Mark Takeshi McGregor that involves electric guitar, flute, and electronics, which will be released on an upcoming album of music featuring guitar by the composer. Here now is my interview with composer and guitarist Alfredo Santa Ana. I'm your host, Adrian Verdejo, for Redshift Radio, coming to you from my home studio in Vancouver, on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Alfredo, thank you so much for joining me in person here today in Vancouver on a very rainy holiday Monday. It's great not only to see you in person, but to be able to do this in person. So thank you, firstly, for joining me today.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here. And I have to say, I'm so impressed with the setup that you have here. You are kitted out. And it's good to be in a place feeling like it's a professional environment. So thank you.
Pleasure. Well, I think we have a lot of catching up to do, but we did kind of bump into each other just a couple months ago at a Sonic Boom concert here in Vancouver, and it was nice to just catch up with you and Mark McGregor and Edward Top afterwards. We went out and just kind of, talked about like it was the old times, actually getting back in person, went out to a bar and talked about music and just talked about composition and what we're up to. So I want to get a little bit more into some of the projects, but that as an overview, have you been both over the pandemic? Have you obviously been maintaining artistically, fruitfully, and engaged and creatively inspired? So how are you emerging back into post-pandemic life?
Well, first off, that it was so good to see you that night. You played a beautiful concert with Mark at Sonic Boom. And it was a great concert, actually, because of all the different, the range of compositions that get performed. You don't get to usually have them in one concert. So it was really good to be there and to do the hang afterwards at the at the bar. But I remember very clearly our conversation. One of the things that we talked about was a couple of missing decades for certain people at the table, where we all kind of went to school at some point in the 90s. And so our popular music interest had to, either take a bit of a sidestep, where we all focused on learning all the repertoire that we never got to listen to on a regular basis, maybe, at least for me. And I know Mark had something similar, and Edward as well. And for me, that decade was like from 95 to 2005 or something like that. I just stopped listening to any music that was not classical. So I have a huge gap in my awareness of a lot of pop music, which I'm starting to get back into because of the band that I have with Edward Top and James Maxwell and Nathan Dillon, who's an excellent bassist here in town. With regards to your second question about the pandemic and how I'm doing with, emerging from it, I feel that when everything started, I had a lot of trepidation and nervousness and anxiety like everybody else. But I have to also admit that I had this kind of weird thought or feeling in the back of my head where I felt like the world was catching up to where I thought the world should be at, not in a calamity necessarily of that proportion, but I felt like, oh, this makes sense, because after a while, all the different, I don't know, like the different capitalist systems and the different ways of engaging with life and others, it just felt a little bit like a bit of like the theme or the through line of existence was sort of getting lost. And I think for me, at least, it was a great time to really reflect, to really think, to appreciate about, what kind of existence you're leading, and whether this is a thing that you can not necessarily live through, but it felt for me like the world was finally at a place where we all needed to address something. And if I think of what the pandemic means for the entire world, it's, to me, this sort of test that we were all put through. And in general, I have to say that in some respects we failed miserably, and in other respects we are coming to terms with now that we know that type of failure, what can we do to maybe move forward and anticipate not like the next one, but these sort of global events that, I don't know, sometimes they do a lot of good for some people. And I personally was able to not really change my way of working, because I work from home. I work alone. I compose and I write music by myself, focusing on absolutely no social aspect of the actual craft. It's me behind a keyboard and behind a system that I'm just doing my work. And so for me, it didn't really change that much, thankfully. I did miss a lot of concerts and a lot of post-show great conversations like the one we had recently. So it's nice to be back in a way.
Do you find, you mentioned just this necessary period of self-reflection and just addressing the global events that were so necessary, I think, for, like you said, a lot of people who maybe are not as introspective as you might expect, somebody who's working in isolation more regularly, and certainly I sympathize for how difficult that could be for some. Are these kinds of themes and the awareness of global issues, are they often things that do affect your creative process, either indirectly, specifically or not, or kind of ignite a sort of a need in yourself to write music, to get your music out there in any way that you can, be it through the band or as a composer, as a film composer, as an improviser, as a guitarist? Did you find kind of an accelerated period of creation, or more of a shift in your creative spirit?
It's hard to point to specific events prior to the pandemic that would have really instigated any kind of creative output out of me, other than an actual commission and actual work. I feel very, very lucky that I have a lot of I work with a lot of people that want me to write music and want me to write music for them. So the system and the way that it was set up with, through the Commission and the Canada Council for the Arts has been very generous with me. And I feel quite lucky to work in that kind of environment where I know that somebody might need a piece, they might give me a call, and some of the limitations or restrictions that they have based on instrumentation, based on the context, like the concert that they're going to perform the piece in, or the duration, kind of guides my writing. Those are the types of projects that I really think give me so much instruction and so much information already, where it's really just about carving out the shape of something. The raw material is already there. Like somebody giving you a big piece of a colored marble, it's going to come out with that type of look already. So you just have to sort of, etch around the pieces. And I think that during the pandemic, of course, things really slowed down, and I did feel a little bit more creative, not desire, but I think experimentation is something that we do in different periods of our lives to try and mitigate risk, because we want to keep working. We want to keep, a level of accessibility for people who I take commissions very seriously, and I want people to get whatever it is that they want to hear out of the music that they commission out of me. And so during the pandemic, I did start experimenting a little bit more and thinking about writing without necessarily having to think about a context so specifically. And I got to say, it's kind of terrifying, because then things get a lot harder when there is no real objective, or where there's no real horizon or target that you're shooting for. Then you're just sort of writing, to thin air. So you have to access yourself in a different way. And like I said, it's very rewarding. And I played a lot of guitar during the pandemic. I have to say, learning how to play an instrument and knowing how to play an instrument makes me feel like you're never alone. So that's, to me, it was the biggest blessing that I think I could have had to really dig into playing a little bit more.
I'm curious, actually, Alfredo, about the fact that you wear so many different hats as a composer and a performer and a songwriter, in different contexts of composition as well, the chamber music, solo music, orchestral music. I think you've done a large piece for us for 18 electric guitars a few years back. But do you find a certain moods or times of the day that you find you want to do rock, or you want to do more the compositional craft, or how do you manage those different kind of hats?
Well, I want to do rock all the time.
Oh yeah, sure.
I mean, there's no time for rock and roll.
Yeah.
No, I want to rock early in the morning. The process is, to me, kind of simple sometimes, because of the different projects that I'm working on. Like if I'm doing film, I can't slow down other projects that like commissions, or people that are waiting for a piece. And yours and Mark's piece actually is quite interesting, because I was working on a large 2-hour film right around April of 2020 when the pandemic hit. And I was working on your composition, on your piece, and on this film score. And it was like an afternoon, morning type of situation. And then evening, I would just sort of revise the work. But lately, I've been able to just, fine tune my schedule a little bit more, where I'm only working on one thing at a time, so that I can really focus and not split my time. The way you have your studio set up, I feel like you could maybe modulate into going into a lesson or into doing some recording of your own if you want. But I would have to switch gears a little bit in my studio. It wouldn't be as easy to just, skip around. And depending on the different instruments that I'm using for a commission or for a individual project or samples, I would have to sort of rearrange certain things. So now I'm a little bit more streamlining my processes, so I can say I can work on this for this long and for that long. And also when I play guitar, when I'm either writing songs for the band or when I'm just practicing the songs, because it's not enough to write them, then you also have to play them, and they're really, really hard.
Yeah, sure. I've seen you
I don't have a good performance background. I used to do a lot of performance in undergrad, because we all had to, I think, as music students. But I definitely didn't do anything after that, right? And it was all composition, and it was all, pre-performative. So now I know that whatever it is that I come up with, I'm going to have to play eventually. So,
we were talking just before this started about the Gretsch guitar, and just the fact that I think a lot of people may not realize when they see, instrumentalists and guitarists specifically changing instruments, not just the guitar and the amount of strings and even electronics, but just the physicality of the instrument actually changes and affects the way you play and write.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple of conversations about like how esoteric you want to be with the different instruments, right? Like a lot of people believe that a certain type of instrument or a certain guitar has this kind of mojo or this type of vibe, and it'll make me perform in this way because I look up to people that play guitar, that play this type of instrument. And so I'm kind of channeling that vibe and that kind of energy. But really, there's a real physicality to the whole enterprise of performing on the instrument. And so, yeah, like the couple of Gretsch guitars that I own are instruments that are not not necessarily idiomatic, but physically comfortable to play for the hand. And it is because, they sound beautiful, but the genre that I'm using them for, it is not the intended purpose for the instrument. And we're talking about models of guitars that were built or designed in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Like the basic shape of the Les Paul Gibson or the Stratocaster has not changed all that much. There's a little bit of relief. There's some chambering in the body that sometimes happens, which really allows for the guitar to be a lot lighter. But the basics of the neck, even though there've been refinements, they're still the same. So you definitely have to adapt to the shape of the instrument.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Square, if you don't mind.
Of course.
We're just mentioning Alfredo's band project, and we're very fortunate. We have 3 very prominent local composers that are friends and friendly enough to actually play together and jam, that have an outlet, I suppose, to kind of get out your other musical ambitions and perhaps parts of your musical past that are more difficult or harder to balance, I think, maybe in the kind of classical compositional world, if only for the purposes of time. I'm curious about how the 3 of you met. Were you friendly beforehand, or was it a conversation similar, like after a concert, talking about like bands that you all enjoyed and listening to? Because I've seen you actually a couple times. Actually, I jammed with you guys early on bass, and I know some of the arrangements, and I know all of your pieces individually as well. There's a lot of different influences, a lot of different stylistic influences, all at the same time. Very smooth transitions in that. Like you said, I guess, the blanket term progressive, I think it is a very general term, but I think the sort of elements I think of in that style of music from the 70s, 80s, and later, there's definitely references, and I think interesting colors that emerge that are very reminiscent, but very uniquely Square. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Square, Alfredo, and how the 3 of you met.
Well, Square is a band that really started with Edward Top, who is the former Vancouver Symphony composer in residence, originally from Holland. And him and I spoke, I think it was around 2016, 2017, about, playing guitar. I think we must have done a Tim Brady piece for Music on Main Ones, 100 Reasons Why.
That's right, yeah.
And I think at that point, maybe he saw that I played guitar or something like that. So we always sort of talked about, oh, you like metal? I like metal because, growing up in the 80s and 90s, we had a lot of different like musical influences that were not strictly based on, classical music or what we would consider part of the Western classical canon. And then, we didn't really make anything out of it. With just out of conversations. But then for a while, he also started talking with another composer, James Maxwell, who is an incredible drummer, Vancouver indie music legend, actually, in the 80s and 90s with a lot of different bands here, Rotor Cloud, The Fourth Floor, and all these different bands that he played with. And I've never, I met James back in, the mid 2000s or something, but I only knew him as a composer. It was unbeknownst to me that he was actually a drummer.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people in our sort of community of contemporary music, we just had no idea that he had this incredible, capacity, not just as a musician, but as a drummer.
Great drummer.
So, one day I met Edward and he said, "Hey, I'm getting together tomorrow with James. Would you like to come in and jam? We're going to go at the Vancouver Academy of Music and just play some jams." And I said, "Yes, please. That'd be great." And so really that was kind of the beginning. And we then sort of squared, no pun intended, but squared off the entire ensemble with an incredible bass player who also is a Vancouver indie legend here in his own right, who played in a number of bands in the 80s and 90s with a lot of commercial success with, he's got stories that I couldn't even begin to grasp in some way, because everything that happened in the 90s in the Pacific West Coast was so exciting, so the knowledge and awareness of all of that scene that he brings is essential for the band, including his vocals and bass playing. And so the 4 of us just started writing songs and started creating this kind of style of music that we did start sort of in the progressive realm because it is abnormal meters, it is odd time signatures every now and then. The sound, though, when you have three composers, we're very experimental sometimes with the way we write. We do a lot of things on the spot. There's a little bit of improvising. James's drumming is never, ever predictable. And what I think of, I think this is going to be a great riff. And if James just goes like this, I think it's going to be like awesome. But he will not do anything like that, and will do something that takes the piece somewhere else completely different.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow. You and I are about the same age, I think, Alfredo, more or less. And so
I think so, yeah.
I think given that we both grew up under the sort of the culture of rock guitar and the 80s, like you said, the 80s and the 90s, which are really sort of a golden age of that, style, and so much great music, even just in the popular vein. I mean, some of the depth of some of the artistry, and I'm biased, of course, my favorites, but to what extent did pre-academic studies influence your musical path? Like, did you have the ambitions early on to be a rock star or to be in a rock band, just simply, or at what point did composition take such a hold in your life?
I think it was. I think composition is, I wanted to call it a distraction out of my rock music ambition, but it's a distraction that continues to provide, tenfold, because music is a vehicle of expression, and it is an interaction between, sounds and listeners, and it has taken over my entire life. But it has been really nice to go back, not necessarily to the roots of why I started listening to music, but I'd be lying if I said that I grew up listening to symphonies and that I grew up listening to, chamber ensembles and string quartets. I had to do a lot of catching up. I grew up in Mexico City, and growing up in Mexico City from 1980 to 1996, which was my, the time that I lived in Mexico, was, I think, for me, incredibly formative, not just because that's the context of my development, but something really important happened around that time. And that's that there was a real galvanization of a Mexican musical alternative identity. So there were a lot of interesting bands from Mexico City, from Latin America, other places like Colombia and Argentina, doing music, sort of coming out of the new wave tradition, maybe that was from the UK and from other parts of Europe, some techno as well, like Italian disco, that type of thing, really kind of hit Mexico hard. And that type of vibe was so influential in these incredible Mexican rock bands that harvested the Mexican identity to create a new type of sound. And if you look at about 6 or 7 seminal albums from that period, there's a couple of names that are really, really important. And one of them is Gustavo Santaolalla, who produced, a ton of those, who produced all of those records, and Adrian Verdejo, the guitarist for King Crimson. Yeah. So interestingly, those two really defined an important sound in that type of genre. And so for me growing up, I was not aware of who these two people even were, but I was listening and getting primed by these types of sounds and these types of performances that they produce. So after a while, for one reason or another, I just wanted to leave Mexico and came to the United States to study music, because at some point I did start trying to play guitar. I wasn't very good at it, so I switched to piano and I took some lessons, and it was great. I had good skills for somebody who practiced as little as I did. I really faked my way through a lot of things, especially in before undergrad. I had the aspiration to maybe be a pianist at one point, but then I actually got into university with an undeclared major. Perhaps I was going to do music. And I just listened for the first time to people who could actually play. And I was just floored. But I wasn't disappointed or discouraged, because I discovered music theory, and then the whole, spectrum of music history kind of opened up. And I decided to go into composition because I had come up with, a couple of tunes here and there. And previously I had been in some rock bands in Mexico, trying, my best at 13, 14 to be, the coolest kid I could be.
Yeah, sure.
And the guitar is the quickest vehicle to do
yeah.
that.
Yeah, at that time, certainly.
So, yeah, and that's kind of how I transitioned into music. And I call this sort of like period as a distraction, not because like all of a sudden my ambition to be a performer or guitarist or whatever was taken away, but really it just kind of morphed into this. And now I'm so happy to see an opportunity where I'm blending both things and really starting to fuse aspects of multimedia, like dance and film and concert music with other forms of pop music.
Yeah. Did you find, it's so interesting that there's this very specific Mexican rock sound that you grew up with and you were, at that time, and it was just unavoidably a part of your formative musical understanding, and it's always, I guess, ingrained into your musical personality in some way.
Yeah.
And though you discovered classical music seriously later, looking back, or perhaps even now, do you find that there's a kind of a identity of the Mexican classical composer or a sound, we know some of the great composers that come from Mexico, certainly in the guitar canon, that we, Manuel Ponce, Carlos Chavez,
Revueltas, a lot of people.
Of course, some wonderful symphonic writing. Were those names that you were aware of, or music that was played during school, or that your parents perhaps introduced you to?
Not at all. No. Unfortunately, growing up in Mexico, I was not aware of all this rich classical music tradition that we had. And it's an interesting kind of process starting to learn about yourself through a framework of Western classical music. So I didn't feel like I served myself well by not listening to this music before, but at the same time, I rejected things that did feed me musically later on because I thought they were less than, perhaps, which now I'm discovering, this is actually so important because there's so much value in being able to listen to a couple of songs by this one particular band and the way that they combine lyrics with the traditional sort of, indigenous cultures of Mexico and the way that they are framing this contemporary society of neoliberalism in Mexico in the 90s was far more important than I gave it credit to. And especially later on thinking like, no, everything has to sound, more modernist, or everything has to be more postmodern, etc. I just felt I was not, it's interesting because on the other hand, when I was writing music for the first time in for instruments, I had a lot of composition professors who would ask me, why don't you sound more like a Mexican composer? And the issue that I have, obviously there's a lot of problems with that question to begin with, but it's the expectation and it's the validation of identity and it's all these different things that I'm still sort of grappling with, right? Like I'm trying to justify having studied for so many years something that perhaps I really value, my classical education and my academic formative years, but at the same time, I feel slightly let down by not being able to already feel good enough to be doing that. I've always had this bit of imposter syndrome whenever it is that anybody is talking about like classical music. I still, even though, I have a doctorate in composition, I still have this sort of inadequacy because I think I listened to way too much pop music growing up, or way too much of one style of music that completely has, never been on my radar.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, you mentioned just being in a certain musical culture and sort of a academic environment affecting your voice as a composer and the way you hear things, and reflecting on things that you already knew and perhaps kind of revising them when you moved to Vancouver. But when you specifically studied at UBC, would you also say that there was a kind of an influence in the air in Vancouver, or a signature West Coast sound that had impact on your writing? And if so, can you actually define it? I often kind of struggle with that. It's like, what is the Vancouver sound? What is the BC? Because there's certainly a very rich and diverse community of composers here, and has a lot to do with the population, the demographics, and people who channeled through the university. So I'm just curious to know how, if at all, your time at UBC affected you as a composer.
Very much. Coming to Vancouver was a decision that, as I think any immigrant's decision, is a very purposeful decision, and it's not an accident why we end up where we do, unless one is escaping a horrible situation as a refugee. But I decided to come to Vancouver not necessarily for the scene per se, but at the time where I was choosing where to come, it was just right after 9/11, and it was very difficult to try and to get to postgraduate education in the United States. So I wanted to leave, and I came to Canada. And for me, one of the most difficult things has been to try and summarize or come up with a few things to say about Canadian music in general, let alone just a Western Canadian sound or a Pacific Northwest sound. It's really difficult. And I'm often in situations where, if I'm traveling or if I'm back in Mexico, people say, well, what does that music sound like? And I can only speak for myself and what it contributed for me. And partly is the formative education that I was experiencing here at UBC, which was really wonderful. But there was a focus, and perhaps I would have come across this in other cities in Canada or even in the US or Europe, but I began to pay attention to the way that I listen, and not just from an aesthetic point of view, from an intellectual point of view, but from a physiological, phenomenological point of view, where I was experiencing a perception of listening. And I think composers like Hildegard Westerkamp, Barry Truax, and to some extent, obviously the music of Schaeffer really impacted the type of mentality that I think I was coming into. And everything that has come out of, the Soundscape project, I think has influenced our musical community a lot. I think of composers like Jordan Nobles or Jennifer Butler, Jocelyn Morlock, and there is, I think, an emphasis on the experience of how we listen. There's a focus on this attention to perceptual, gradual evolution in the sound that we are experiencing, rather than perhaps a strong specific musical grammar, like we are going to use this type of, chords and these types of functions, and we're going to, use these systems that can be theorized and projected and mapped out, etc. There's, I think, a focus on the perception of listening and a focus on what it is to listen.
And you're right. I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of the lineage from Schaeffer. Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned those names, particularly Jordan Nobles, who's been so proactive here in the community to develop Redshift and, specifically try to stage these types of experiential listening environments. So I think fortunate for yourself and other composers to have had that sort of support from senior and also composers around our same age and bracket. I think also the types of venues and sort of the presentation, I think, has a lot to do also with the public response, and perhaps, has a little bit more inviting quality to it, not only from the public's point of view as an audience, but also for the composers. I think there's a good diversity in the language here, and yet there's a lot of validity in what everybody does, and we can see, I think in Canada in general, the associations to the academic, this person studied with this person at this university, and there's a kind of signature sound, but very specifically, geographically, even within the same province, you'll have a kind of a mixed bag of different influences. So it's curious to hear that, Alfredo. Actually, coming back to your discussion of growing up in Mexico and some of your collaborations, I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about your maybe not so recent project with Mark Takeshi McGregor, a good mutual friend and collaborator of both of us. Firstly, how the two of you decided or came to meet each other and started working together, but more specifically about the content of the piece. I know it's an ode to Leonora Carrington, and I believe the two of you traveled to Mexico to present this in a festival, actually in the museum itself. Please tell us more about the project. Please tell me how to pronounce the title. I know it's Carrington backwards.
That's right.
We can start there.
The name of the piece is, you can call it Not Iraq or Not Iraq if you want to be more specific to the name, but it is a British name, Carrington, and it's just spelled backwards. So there really is no fixed pronunciation. I think it can be anything you want it to be. But as I guess where I would start here is with my acquaintance with Mark Takeshi McGregor, who is, in my view, one of Canada's leading contemporary flute players. And I think that he has done so much for Canadian music in general that is, I cannot sing his praises enough. And so he invited me to write a piece back in, I think it was about 2014, 2015. And we sat down to talk, as one does with performers. And when one is commissioned, you sit down and you talk about what kind of a piece do you want, and what kind of things do we both like that we could, sort of sink our teeth into a little bit. And so Mark is also an incredible artist, and he does a lot of different landscapes and surreal figures. And at one point during our conversation, when we were discussing this commission, we both talked about a surreal exhibition that took place here in Vancouver, a really important exhibition, which I think was called The Color of Your Dreams. And it took place sometime in 2011. And it in the Vancouver Art Gallery. And at that time, I know we both saw the exhibition, and we discussed the exhibition at length and some of the works that really impacted us. And a couple of the works were by Leonora Carrington. And I grew up in Mexico City, and Leonora Carrington is a fixture of Mexico because throughout her life, after being married to Max Ernst, she immigrated to Mexico trying to escape the war. She was born in Lancashire in the UK and then had to live in Spain for a while in a slight exile because of all the war. And she came into Mexico, I believe, sometime in the 40s or after the war, maybe like in the 50s. But at some point, she was an incredible figure in the surrealist movement in Mexico. And she was in touch with Remedios Varo. She was in touch with Frida Kahlo and with Diego. And she died, unfortunately, in 2011. But Mexico City is littered with a lot of different sculptures that she did. And she was an incredible visual artist as well, not just a spatial artist. She is a painter, and she is also a storyteller. She wrote a lot of different books, and one book in particular, a series of short stories, I should say. Mark and I were talking about sort of maybe we should do a piece based on her art. Maybe we should do a piece based on her sculpture. And I said, what if we do a piece based on some of her short stories, because they're incredibly grotesque and surreal and nonsensical. And so we just thought that would be a really good idea. And after I finished the piece, based on Carrington, I named it Not in Iraq because I thought it would be a cool play on the mirror of her name, which she used a lot of, projection and mirrors images in her visual work. But also in the short stories, there are words that are mistyped on purpose, and there's words that are and stories and names that have different types of meanings, forwards and backwards. And I guess at some point after I finished the piece, Mark contacted the Museo de Leonora Carrington, which is a museum in San Luis Potosí, Mexico, where a lot of her sculptures are housed. And it is an incredible museum because it was built on an old prison. And so they use the shell of the prison and all the different cell blocks as different wings for the gallery. And it's a great cultural center and a great cultural space. And he wrote the museum on a whim, just asking, hey, we have this piece written by this Mexican composer. Would you ever be interested in presenting it in your museum? We would really love to go down there. And they answered like within 24 hours or something. And we were just everything from working with the museum was just such smooth sailing. We had a great time down there. They did invite us to go down and to film. They gave us the entire museum. They gave us the keys basically to the whole space.
Wow.
And we were able to film right next to the sculptures. They gave us permission to, license all of the visuals that are housed in the museum for the video. And so that's how that came about. And in November of 2019 is when we were down there and we filmed it.
Yeah, and there's a beautiful video out there somewhere, I think, of collaboration you. And did you hook up with a filmmaker in Mexico, actually, or who did the videography for that?
The videography was a really talented Mexican director from San Luis Potosí, recommended by the museum, Bernardo Gonzalez, who's an incredible director in his own right as well, because he teaches at the university in San Luis Potosí. I believe he teaches like a couple of film courses, and just recently completed really interesting films of short films based on Mexican folkloric legends of the region. So it's quite beautiful.
Oh, fantastic. It's amazing how these things just come together magically sometimes. And yeah, just the magic of sending out an email and actually finding people who are so generous and helpful and actually willing to set things up and help bridge.
And it was just amazing to be down there in, after 2 flights, we landed in San Luis Potosí, and you're in a very different world. Like, it feels almost like you've gone to Europe. For Mark, I remember he mentioned something while we were down there that, we should do this more. We should be in Mexico more.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah. And working with all the different departments down there for the video performance, for the different for the festivals and the parties that go down in the museum itself, because it's quite an interesting facility that serves also a bit of as a community center. So it's a very lively environment. After we did the concert, we filmed a video, obviously, and then they invited Mark to do a public presentation performance during one of their museum nights. And after we were finished, there were a couple of DJs that showed up, and because it's open air, the building is open, no ceiling, so to speak. So it's just sort of al fresco. We had, it's like almost like a rave or a party.
Very cool. Yeah. Very cool. Speaking of your work with Mark and giving a little bit of plug also for our duo, one of the projects that we were working on and was delayed during the pandemic, but we had actually planned to go to Morelia, the 3 of us, and fortunately I think the plans are in motion to see that forward again, perhaps at the end of this year, fingers crossed. But you have written a piece that we commissioned from you entitled Wave Remote. It's a piece for electric guitar and flute with electronics and heavy use of looping. So it really creates this beautiful, very full dimension that one might not expect from a flute and guitar. It really goes quite outside the box, and I think really reflects a lot of the influences you discussed today. In terms of your past in Mexican, both rock music, I think even some elements of, rhythmic elements of Mexican folkloric music.
Yeah.
And if you can tell us a little bit about the larger album in which this is tying into. I know we talked a bit after the concert about this album that you're producing of electric guitar music, much of which is your own recent compositions for both classical guitars, the electric guitar piece, and also you're undertaking and perhaps have finished a recording of Steve Reich's monumental electric counterpoint. Please tell us about this, Alfredo. Was this an idea that came to you somewhat recently, or was this always part of the plan of commissioning this group of pieces with guitar?
Well, it has different origin points, but I have to also point to you for this because you commissioned the piece for you and Mark, and you guys invited me to write this piece for electric guitar and flute. And once I finished the piece, and now that it's like in the process of being recorded, I wanted to like put it out there. And one of the things that I found out during the pandemic is just, learning how to distribute albums and how to upload things to Apple Music and the different distribution centers. It was just something that I did with a couple of other albums. So it gave me this idea. What if I just put out an album of guitar music? And guitar, because it's one of the instruments that I first learned how to play, but an instrument that I never really sort of approached with the, not with the respect, but you know what I mean? Like it's in school, I was never encouraged perhaps to compose for guitar, and not to knock education or whatever, but I don't think I would have had I don't even want to say the proper mentoring for it, but I guess there's not really a big context for guitar music in Canada. But anyway, and hopefully that's changing, and we'll see. But anyway, so this whole project was started with the piece that I wrote for electric guitar and flute for you and Mark, and also for the piece that you mentioned earlier, the piece for 18 guitars. I wanted to also, put all of these pieces that I've done in one album, basically. So that's kind of the origin for the thing.
And there's a relatively new guitar duet for classical guitars, commissioned by the Made in Canada duo as well.
That's right.
Please tell us about that.
Nathan Brenson and Michael Ibsen, who are both great guitarists here in Canada. I got the opportunity to write for them right during the pandemic, and because they were Michael Ibsen lives in Holland and Nathan lives in Ottawa. And so what they did is that they each recorded their parts individually and separately and sent them to me. And I put them together here in Vancouver, and that's how the recording came about. But the interesting thing about that project, or at least about that piece, is that neither of them knew what the other performer was playing. So they were playing to a click track, basically. And then I let them listen to the finished product as a way of encapsulating a little bit of what we were all experiencing in some way, where, we're in isolation working on our own projects, and eventually we're all going to get together again, and we're going to see what happens once that occurs. So that was sort of the impetus behind that project. And it worked really well, because when you have a click, there's a lot of variations, because I told them, don't play mechanically, play naturally and do whatever you need to do. But so I was able to sort of, layer them together. And so that's another piece that's going to be in the album. And around this time, and after I had finished writing the piece for you and Mark, I guess during the pandemic when I was playing, I thought, let me see if I can play a little bit of this incredible piece by Steve Reich, the Electric Counterpoint, that I remember just falling in love with when I first listened to classical music. I thought, oh, this is what contemporary music can sound like. Let's do this. We can do it. It was really, really inspiring. And I know we've talked about this quite a bit. There's a datedness about the piece, and there's a stuffiness almost in how some of the harmonic language sort of evolves. But I wanted to play the piece, and I couldn't find the backing track. And Electric Counterpoint is like this live guitar playing on top of 12 other guitars that have been taped or recorded before. So I thought, why don't I just try to record all the parts? And then that became a thing, and it was an undertaking, and I screwed up the first version of it royally by using different guitars and different string gauges and different picks, and it was unusable. So I started it again, and now I feel like I'm kind of happier with that product. So I started, working on so much music for guitar and then playing in the band, that I thought, okay, I need to come out with a record that's going to have some guitar on it.
Did you wrestle with the recording process of the Reich piece in particular? I always, because I played it so many years ago and recorded it as well, and I think I would take a very different approach these days. But one of the things that also struck me when I was recording it, and having heard a lot of referenced recordings as well, is how much is appropriate to superimpose kind of the personality of the sound of the guitar on the music itself, and I think that can easily happen. I think we're just used to playing with overdrive and effects and even reverb. I think the attached Matheny tape did have reverb on it, I recall.
Oh, yeah.
And there, I think, was an example also of, just a very idiomatic and very stylistic way of playing, which I think a lot of players have adopted. I've enjoyed a lot of radical different takes on that piece, both in terms of the timbre, the attack, the particular elements of muting, and like you mentioned, just having different guitars, which is something that can be embraced. But I think I also kind of went for the homogenized, streamlined sound. Was that kind of your goal in mind? You mentioned kind of scrapping the first draft because of different, having to blend different levels and timbres and guitar styles. I mean, like we said before, just the style of guitar has so much effect on the recording process and the outcome. So what was your impetus? Did you have a specific reference recording in mind, or were you always a big fan of that composer's music and style?
Yeah. I was a fan of the composer. I think, as everybody, I think, has some kind of strong opinion about Steve Reich, whether that's towards some of the baggage that his music already has. And with this piece in particular, it is not without, it's not without a lot of attention to some of its origins that I took this on and decided to do it still because of my love for what it meant to me to first encounter it. And what I was hoping to do with my sort of approach to the piece was to really match that excitement. And again, with this idea of the Vancouver sound, thinking of how we perceive sound and how we remember sound and how we relate to sound from this physiological perspective. It was a piece of music that to me really made me feel my body differently. And it really kind of resonated in a way that I thought was worth trying to figure out how to do. And I remember it's Pat Metheny's version is the original version that was recorded, and that's the version that I listened to. And going back to it, there have been multiple recordings done since then. Obviously, Johnny Greenwood did a version, and all over Europe it's been recorded as well. I hadn't come across a Canadian version, so that was also another big incentive that I wanted to do one version for myself. But the thing that I realized when I went back and re-listened to that original version of the piece that I remember falling in love with was just how different it sounded and how muted it was and how rich with reverb and how different I would do it now, how different I wish it would sound. And it was this engagement of wanting to experience the piece with a different type of approach to sound. And because of the amazing technology advances in, home studio recordings and interfaces, I just thought, let's try to do this in a way that to me feels like I can understand the piece better and I can service the piece in a way that is meaningful to me.
Wondering about your compositional process as a guitarist and the difference between when you're writing music for guitar or with guitar, and when you're writing music that maybe for traditional chamber or ensemble or vocalists or otherwise. Do you think differently when you have a guitar in your hand and you're working out passages, or do you use the guitar primarily as a harmonic instrument when you're composing chamber music? Do you wrestle with the sort of identity of a guitarist always, approaching music, or do you embrace it? Or was there a time where you felt like you had to be sort of a serious traditional composer that eschews the guitar?
Well, this is the thing. Like I never learned how to write music for guitar, and I never learned how to read music for guitar. So even though I can work my way around a score no problem, I still struggle identifying notes on the guitar because I never bothered to, where's that E in particular? Like I know the string names and I know the frets and all that stuff, but I never connected the two in any meaningful way. I did play double bass in orchestra in university, and I can read my way through a bass line score no problem, and I could probably play double bass right now or do a very poor reading of some orchestral part by Haydn or whatever. But with guitar, I just never connected the two things. Piano, it's also fine, but it's one of those things that to me, I would never use the guitar to compose anything. I usually just use the keyboard and then, transcribe things to guitar as how the guitarist would play it. And then I make the adjustments as if I was the guitarist, thinking, well, obviously this is really difficult to do. So let me just adjust it to what is capable and what is here in the hand.
Yeah, interesting. I often wonder about that. It's, certain composers in the guitar literature specifically, which for whatever reason has its own kind of separate trajectory from the mainstream kind of stream of classical, modern music, or even historically. I think the guitar's been an offshoot sort of thing. Yeah. It reflects the general style, but because of so many traps on the instrument and sort of idiosyncratic things that really you do have to have an instrument to kind of work certain things out and know, you know, how to use it both effectively and not to over clutter, I guess, the voicing, certain things that are kind of,
absolutely,
you know, more keyboard-like in some ways.
And especially electric guitar too, in a contemporary music context, it's kind of riddled with meaning, right? If you bend a note at the right time within a scale, you're going to very quickly go into territory that is referencing something that is very, very specific. And so it's an instrument that's really, I think, that is very difficult to not sound like something that has been already done before, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Because I often think about this, you know, the sound of an overdriven, distorted guitar was something that at one point was completely new and radical and like from outer space, you know, and when people first heard it, it blew their mind. You know, and then also in the time we grew up, it became so palatable, you know, that the sound of an overdriven guitar you could hear on America's Funniest Home Videos and the bumpers, and, you know, it's like, it's not really offensive, it's not confrontational. And I think that is an element that, you know, because of rock and sort of the more subversive elements with, you know, popular music and that, which can be embraced, but often referenced inadvertently as well. And, you know, at worst, I think, cliche, and sometimes just like, you know, accidentally somebody sees it with an electric guitar, they just have that baggage, like this sort of thing. It carries a lot of identity, and it's very, very flavorful. It's kind of like this, if you're going to use it, it's kind of use at your own risk kind of thing. It's very difficult to, I think, blend an electric guitar successfully within a chamber ensemble, because it is going to sound like an electric guitar. And unless you're identifying it as that instrument and incorporating some of those stylistic elements, let it be, you know, like rock or blues or jazz, you know, it's really going to be difficult to not do that. I think there are obviously exceptions, and maybe we're kind of generalizing here, but the sound of the electric guitar and its different manipulations it's almost like there's playing electric guitar, but then there's also knowing how to record it and then how to abuse the different ways of playing with that sound, right? Because anything from a wah pedal to like a whammy to the different pickups that you might use in a guitar, it's this kind of infinitely modular instrument that is very akin to the synthesizer and akin to the times. It's the perfect 20th century instrument, right? Facilitating musicians an easeability of use, because anybody can strum a chord, anybody can pluck a string. It's not like, you know, you can spend months trying to get a tone from a saxophone or a flute or a cello. But the guitar, I think people can pick it up quickly and very fast. We can do so much with it. So it's a really powerful instrument and underrepresented in our contemporary music community, not for the lack of skilled performers, I think just for the lack of repertoire that, to me, properly fuses the instrument with other instruments. I mean, that's why I'm doing an album of guitar music with guitar and not so many other instruments. Mark is the only sort of flute of the other musician with another instrument like flute. Yeah, and I was very impressed in the demo that we did last year, I think, Mark and I, of the piece and its first version of the effect of traditional stomp box effects with the flute. I mean, it was like really cool to hear the flute going through the octaver pedal and of course the looper, and actually kind of interesting also to see Mark as, you know, somebody who, of course, he's so steeped in the contemporary idiom and is always doing new experimental projects in that, but kind of acting like a guitar player, stomping pedals, you know, thinking about those sorts of things, you know, treating the sound sometimes like, am I hearing an ebow? Am I hearing a flute? Like the two kind of timbres are married in a way that you would never normally hear, but also has a strong orchestral reference. And I thought that was quite fascinating in that.
Yeah. Well, we talked about it when we were first sort of thinking about doing the piece. And one of the trappings of flute and guitar is that the guitar will, you know, I think often will be relegated this accompanying role within a homophonic texture. So the flute will take all of the soloing and all of the melodic, beautiful lines. And of course, the guitar can also solo and do all of that stuff. But it's a natural fit because you have different strings that can play harmonically, all these types of functional musical grammars. And with the flute being amplified, I think we brought the flute into the electric guitar world in a way that I wanted Mark to be able to accompany the guitar more than, you accompany Mark.
Yeah, yeah. Can you tell us, Alfredo, about your work as a film composer? I was just checking out your website and seeing that you have some projects that date back quite some time, and actually a couple more recent ones that you had done with. Is it Titus Heckel?
That's right.
The filmmaker here locally in Vancouver, I assume. In the last couple of years, tell us how that came into your being as a musician, as a creator.
Sure. I was really lucky in university to be acquainted with a great filmmaker named Jamie Travis. And he also studied at UBC. So we were sort of contemporaries around the same time in the mid-2000s. And he did a series of short films, and he invited me to score those films. I did not have any experience. I'd had a desire to try and write music for film, and I had done it in a short film previous to my work with him. But it was a very sort of experimental kind of thing where I just used a piece of music that I had written and then just put it against the image, right? But then in working with him, he has a visual style that is so strong and a real kind of voice from a directorial type of place, so it's not in reference to it wasn't like action genre, or it wasn't comedy genre. It was like its own thing. It had a lot of suspense, and when you're working with such a strong directorial type of voice, it really kind of upped my game with some of the music that I had to write. And whenever you write music for film, you have to understand that that's what it's supposed to be. And it is not supposed to necessarily, it can stand out, of course, but it is at the service of how it's going to best support the overall vision.
Visual art obviously is a theme in your music, also in your concert works as well. In that case, are you presented raw footage of the film? Do you compose, as you're watching, or do you make revisions based on how the film is progressing itself?
I very carefully gauge the projects that I'm involved with, because I think there's a lot of industry trappings of having to work really, really fast and having to have really, really tight deadlines. And as great as some of the budgets can be in the film industry, as great as they can be, it is something that I have to choose very, very carefully. And one of the things that I use to decide is how much time I'm going to have, and whether I'm going to have an actual idea of what the film is going to look like before, and how much time I'm going to have with it before then. And also, how much temp music are you going to use as a filmmaker? Because what I always ask filmmakers and directors whenever anybody wants to work together, I say, why do you want music in your film? Because a lot of the times, actually, if you just don't use any music, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of your footage. And it is just sometimes, it's been my experience in the past with some filmmakers and in different projects that I've done, where certain things that directors choose to do with the music is to help the performance or the editing move along in a way that, honestly, if this would have been redone or relit or reacted in a different way, you wouldn't have needed the support that the music has here delivered you. But I've been also really lucky to work with really talented directors that just let me do what I want, and that's also great.
Well, that's perfect. Yeah. Always having trusted collaborators. And lastly, Alfred, I wanted to talk about actually a project that I saw, and you had produced a vinyl recording over the last year or so of ambient music, including some spoken word, poetry, and collaboration with your partner, also Allison. Please tell us about that. How's your experience? Are you a vinyl buff yourself? Or?
I wanted to do vinyl as this sort of, to me, it's a bit of a holy grail, right? And to put out a recording in vinyl is like entering this space of history. Committing something to vinyl to me is creating something that we're so used to doing stuff on our computers, right? But here I had to pay attention to the transfer and the work of translating that digital sound onto a physical space. We're talking about music after all, and sound, which is an acoustic mechanical process. It is something that exists physically around us. And when you hear something in vinyl, to me, the experience is far more intimate, perhaps, because I know that there is a physical object in the same room that I am that is vibrating at this sort of right frequency and time, translating these tiny little grooves on a piece of fabric and creating a stereo image. I mean, that is still, it still boggles my mind. I can maybe see how a sound is produced, you know, like by following the grooves and the needle sort of translating this, but then produce the stereo image as well. I mean, and then there's all sorts of like algorithms and physics that are involved in it. So it was super satisfying to create a whole album of ambient music, which is, you know, very delicate and very, not sensitive. I wouldn't say that it's very precious, but when you commit it to vinyl, you are thinking about how you're going to ultimately experience this music, right? So I was very attuned to that experience.
It's something that I always thought was magical as well. It's just watching the sort of the hypnotic aspect of watching the turntable going, even sort of the artifacts of some of the hiss and the crackling and, you know, the sort of warmth that we expect, which is, you know, a pleasant harmonic distortion that's lacking from, you know, a modern, very clear sounding recordings that we have in the digital space, but we are losing that kind of tactile, you know, really important, like you said, intimate quality.
Oh yeah.
I'm happy to see that vinyl is making such a comeback, actually.
I know. The concept of acoustic artifact too, I'm glad you bring that up, because I based a lot of the music on found acoustic artifacts. So I scoured the internet for spoken word and different types of poetry readings and film dialogue, which was an incredible process to clear all the rights for all those samples, I have to say.
Sure.
And very rewarding in a way, but everything's cleared. And what I wanted to do with the album conceptually, because I would brand it a concept album if I can be as bold. So it's a concept ambient album that is based on an ontological night walk. So if you think of yourself in some type of urban area at night and isolated, and you're walking through this, you know, landscape of artifacts, finding perhaps a broken bell, hearing sound, there's some rain and there's environment. And we go back to one of the conversations we were having earlier about, you know, the concept of a sound walk, like that Westerkamp does so incredibly well here. It's that type of approach that I wanted to write these sort of small digital miniatures and place them on a vinyl record as its own acoustic artifact. So you have this, you know, double translation where there's sound that took place at some point in history and in some point in time, and then you have it repurposed and reframed, completely detached from its original source and defamiliarized with its original source, and repurposed into something that I'm doing, and then once again made into a physical object to be played in people's living rooms or sound rooms.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Alfredo, I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insight and insight into your history and growth as a composer. So multifaceted, and we look forward to hearing the completed album with the guitar music when in fact we complete it. Mark and I actually get our butts in gear and get this thing recorded.
Absolutely.
But moreover, thank you so much for sharing. It's very nice to catch up again in person, and please don't be a stranger.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Happy to be here.
Pleasure.
Cheers.